Ever had to confront someone older than you and stand your ground?
Thanksgiving always had a way of flattening me out, like steamrolling whatever pieces of myself I'd spent the year putting back together, and this one wasn't any different, except that I'd promised myself in the car, halfway through hour two of traffic and numb fingers gripping a lukewarm travel mug, that I wasn't going to flinch this time. I wasn't going to bite my tongue until it bled, or nod and smile like I always did when my mom praised Julie's husband for opening that second gym, or when she laughed too loudly at Matt's recycled stories about clients he barely knew. I was just going to survive the meal, bring the dessert, do my part, and then slip back into my quiet, unremarkable life without a scene. That was the plan, simple, unambitious, and familiar. But even the smallest plans can detonate if they're packed with enough history. The house hadn't changed in 20 years. Same wreath with the faded ribbon, same chipped ceramic turkey by the door, same rug I once threw up on when I was 7 and too anxious to eat mashed potatoes. My parents were the type to preserve things they liked, and unfortunately, things they liked rarely included me. I walked in without knocking because despite everything, I still knew better than to treat this place like anything other than home, and the first thing I heard was laughter. Mom's voice, pitched sharp and bright like a bell that rings just a little too long, carried from the kitchen. She was talking to Matt about some article that featured his firm, her pride practically poured into the air, thick as syrup. Julie hugged me first, quick and distracted, her perfume stinging like it always did, too citrusy, like something expensive she didn't really need. "Emily, you look good," she said, with that tight, evaluative smile women give each other when what they mean is, "I was worried you'd look worse." Her kids were upstairs, probably breaking something or scrolling through iPads they weren't supposed to bring. Derek, her husband, waved from the couch like a guy on vacation. Matt barely looked up from his phone but gave me a fist bump like we were teammates. Carol, my mother, took one look at me, then turned back to basting the turkey. "No, how was the drive? No, I'm glad you made it," not even the practiced smile she always gave strangers at church. She just said, without turning around, "Desserts in the fridge? That store-bought pecan pie you always bring." And I said yes, because correcting her felt useless. I hung my coat by the door and scanned the room like I always did, noting what had changed. New curtains. A framed diploma of Julie's husband's MBA next to Matt's wedding photo. Nothing of mine. Not even a postcard from my trip to Spain, which I know I sent because I wrote it with shaking hands on the edge of a balcony and double-checked the address 3 times. I stood for a second longer than I should have, and then I forced myself into motion, asking if she needed help with anything. Mom handed me the rolls with a simple, "You can set the table," like I was the help, like I was lucky to be included. We all sat down 20 minutes later, plates full, kids bouncing, wine already half empty, and the conversation immediately turned into a performance. Matt talked about stocks like we were all riveted by tech investments. Julie showed pictures of her remodeled bathroom, and I chewed slowly and quietly, trying not to choke on the sense that I was just background noise. Every story ended with Mom's enthusiastic agreement or some proud anecdote she'd repeat for years. She didn't ask about my writing, didn't mention the book I'd finally finished after 3 years, didn't even flinch when I said I might be moving cities. It was like none of it mattered. But the moment that really sliced deep, the one that started this whole damn thing, came right before dessert. We were clearing plates, half standing, half laughing, and Carol lifted her wine glass with a grin that looked more like a smirk. "Before pie," she said, "I just want to raise a quick toast to the real achievers in this family, those who never gave up on themselves, who stayed the course, who built something solid and real." I couldn't be prouder. She looked directly at me when she said it, dead in the eyes, as if daring me to react, as if to say, "This isn't for you." Everyone clinked glasses. Julie beamed. Matt nodded like a king accepting tribute. And I swallowed a piece of air so sharp I thought it might draw blood. I helped with dessert. I scooped the whipped cream, I passed the pie, I asked Derek how his back was after surgery. I smiled through clenched teeth and told Julie's oldest that his math project sounded super interesting, even though I had no idea what the hell he was talking about. And when the kitchen was cleared and everyone shuffled toward the living room to watch football, I found myself alone for a moment, just me, the hum of the fridge, and the notepad that always lived under the "Don't forget the milk" magnet. I stood there, my hand already halfway toward it, before I even knew what I was doing. The plan had been to keep my mouth shut, remember? But something about the look Mom gave me, like I was a cautionary tale she couldn't wait to wrap in plastic and shove to the back of the fridge with the other expired leftovers, made my spine straighten. Maybe it was the years of birthday cards signed with just her name. Maybe it was the way she told people I dabbled in writing, as if 20 years of stories and sacrifices were just a cute little hobby. Or maybe it was just the fact that I was tired, bone-deep tired, of being invisible in the one place that should have seen me first. That night, I left a note by the fridge. And the next morning, Julie texted, "What did you do?" She didn't sleep all night. What I did wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. But it was honest. And for a family like mine, sometimes honesty is the most violent thing you can serve at dinner. There's a strange weight that settles on your chest when you're surrounded by people who share your blood, but still somehow make you feel like a guest at your own life's table. And sitting between Julie, flushed from her second glass of Pinot and busy showing off a video of her son's piano recital, and Matt, who had already started pulling out his phone again while simultaneously giving a speech about real estate markets, as if the rest of us had applied to be his interns, I couldn't help but feel like I'd stepped into someone else's holiday, one where I'd accidentally shown up without the right name tag or credentials. The air in the dining room felt tight, as though every smile had been ironed flat and every word carefully chosen to maintain some illusion of harmony, and yet, even in that performative civility, I could still feel the sharpness of everything unsaid grazing just beneath the surface. I cut into my turkey with the kind of mechanical precision that comes from decades of repetition, decades of showing up and doing the thing, smiling at the right jokes, praising the same renovations, nodding politely when someone makes an offhand remark that digs a little too deep, but no one dares to call it what it is. Carol, seated at the head of the table like the matriarch she always believed herself to be, surveyed us like a CEO doing her annual performance review, making little notes in her mind, deciding which children had increased in value and which had stagnated. She was a master of the microgesture, a woman who could level your confidence with the arch of an eyebrow or a 2-second pause too long after a comment you were foolish enough to think deserved acknowledgement. I remember sitting there, listening to Julie detail her PTA responsibilities as though she were running NATO, and I glanced around the table, wondering if anyone else noticed how much space I didn't take up. No one asked about the manuscript I'd finished in October, the one I'd spent the better part of 3 years waking up at 5 in the morning to write before clocking in at my copywriting job. No one mentioned the essay I'd published in that small but respected magazine, likely because no one had read it, despite me posting the link in the family group chat 2 weeks ago. Instead, the focus remained steadfastly on achievements that could be photographed, posted, or framed, things with visible value, things you could hold up at a dinner party and say, "See what we've made?" At one point, Derek started going on about the renovations they were planning for their basement, some conversion into a media room with a wine fridge and a Peloton, and Mom leaned in like he was reciting scripture, nodding and murmuring, "That's just smart," every few sentences, while I sat there trying to remember the last time she'd asked me if I was happy, not successful, not productive, not making enough to finally get out of that apartment, just happy. The realization that she hadn't ever asked, "Not really," hit me harder than I expected, and I had to blink a few times to clear the sting from my eyes before anyone noticed. Somewhere between the green beans and the second round of stuffing, I caught Mom looking at me, not with malice or anger, those would have at least acknowledged my presence, but with a kind of flat disinterest that felt more brutal than either. She looked at me the way you look at something you forgot to throw away but now can't be bothered with. And I realized in that moment that she had stopped expecting anything from me a long time ago, probably somewhere around the year I dropped out of law school, or maybe even earlier, when I stopped bringing boyfriends around or started publishing essays that weren't always flattering about a certain type of mother. It wasn't just disappointment I saw in her face, it was dismissal. After the plates were cleared and everyone shifted to the living room, I hung back in the kitchen, automatically rinsing things and loading the dishwasher while the rest of the family shouted over the game in the background. The kitchen, usually Mom's sanctuary, was now briefly mine, and in the quiet hum of appliances and clinking dishes, I found something close to clarity. I stood there, elbow deep in warm water, thinking about how many times I'd played this exact role: the helper, the extra hands, the quiet cleanup crew after the real people were done performing. And it hit me just how deeply invisible I'd allowed myself to become in this house. I thought about every single Thanksgiving where I'd driven hours just to be minimized, every holiday card where my name was squeezed in like a footnote, every family photo where I stood at the edge, holding someone else's purse. I thought about how often I'd swallowed pride, hurt, and silence like cold gravy, convincing myself that being part of the family meant enduring the subtle cruelties that no one else seemed to notice or care about. And I thought, maybe for the first time, that I wasn't willing to keep doing it just for the sake of tradition. As I reached for the dish towel and wiped my hands dry, my eyes fell on the notepad attached to the fridge with that old souvenir magnet from the Grand Canyon, an ironic little relic from a trip I hadn't been invited to. The notepad, normally reserved for grocery lists and half-forgotten errands, suddenly seemed like an open stage, a space that could hold more than eggs and paper towels. It felt like the only blank page in the entire house where I might be allowed to say something that wouldn't be immediately edited, challenged, or ignored. I didn't grab it right then. I just stood there staring at it, the corner curling slightly, the pen dangling from its attached string like it was daring me to pick it up. My reflection in the glossy black oven door behind it looked calm, maybe even serene, but my chest was buzzing like it had been plugged into a socket. I wasn't angry, not in the way I used to be when I was 20 and thought that shouting could fix everything. I was something quieter now, sharper. Tired in a way that only comes from trying to be heard by people who never learned how to listen. As laughter roared from the living room and Julie shouted something about pumpkin pie, I picked up the towel again and dried the already clean counter. Not because it needed it, but because I needed the motion. The hum of the fridge filled the silence behind me, steady and low like a heartbeat. And I thought, very simply, maybe this year I don't leave empty-handed. Maybe this year I leave a message instead. There's a particular silence that settles over a house after the noise has emptied out, the kind of silence that doesn't just sit in the air but presses against your skin, reminding you of everything you're not saying. And as I stood in the kitchen, the dishes done, the counters wiped clean, the fridge humming steadily like it had something to say but wouldn't dare interrupt, I realized that this was the first moment all day where I didn't feel like I was being measured, ranked, or quietly dismissed. Everyone else had drifted to the living room, the TV murmuring low, a football game no one really cared about playing in the background while they rehashed the same stories I'd heard at every gathering since Julie got married and Matt got promoted for the first time. I had played my part, performed the obligatory gratitude, smiled at all the right moments, and clapped politely when Mom bragged yet again about Julie's ability to balance motherhood and professional brilliance as though it were some kind of Olympic sport, and I was just a spectator, clutching a plastic flag with no country to wave it for. I stood with my back to the fridge, arms crossed, and stared at the notepad, its paper slightly curled at the corners, as if even it had aged under the weight of routine and repetition. The pen, a cheap clicky one with faded lettering from a dental clinic, hung by its string like it had been waiting for someone to pick it up and write something that mattered, something that wasn't milk or dog food or pick up dry cleaning. And in that stillness, in that absurdly ordinary moment, I made the decision. Not a dramatic, fiery choice filled with cinematic clarity, but a quiet, methodical shift, the kind that sneaks in so subtly you don't realize you've passed the point of no return until the words are already on the page. I pulled out a chair, sat down at the kitchen table, and placed the pad in front of me like I was preparing for an exam. I held the pen but didn't start writing right away, because I knew that whatever I said, whatever I committed to paper, would have to be exact, not cruel or emotional or exaggerated, but precise, honest, and impossible to refute. It wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about visibility, about putting myself into a room that had spent years pretending I wasn't in it. So I started with the only truth that mattered. I noticed. The words came slowly at first, like pulling a thread that had been knotted for years. I noticed that you only take photos with Julie's kids for the Christmas card. I noticed that when Matt speaks, you stop chewing. I noticed that you've never once asked to read anything I've written, even when I've published it, even when I've mailed it to you with a handwritten note. I noticed that the word successful always seems to have conditions I never meet. I paused, the pen hovering over the page, and glanced toward the hallway where their laughter had risen again. Julie saying something about a vacation they were planning, Mom responding with that bright, exaggerated tone she reserves for moments she wants to remember later and turn into a story. I turned back to the notepad and kept writing. I noticed how you use the word real like it's a weapon. Real jobs. Real families. Real achievements. I noticed how you thanked the real achievers today and looked directly at me like you wanted me to understand just how far outside that category you still think I live. I noticed how I've shown up every year with pie, with patience, with gifts, with time, and how each time I walk back to my car with less of myself than I arrived with. I didn't cry while writing it, though a tightness had settled in my throat that made breathing feel heavier than usual. The pen scratched across the paper with surprising ease, the ink drying quickly, the letters forming like they had been waiting years to come out. I kept the tone even, resisted the temptation to accuse or plead. I didn't ask for anything. I didn't say please, or why, or can't you just. I simply laid it out like a trail of breadcrumbs, the kind you leave behind not to be followed, but to mark the path you've finally chosen to walk away from. I'm not angry. I'm exhausted. I'm not dramatic. I'm done pretending. I'm not jealous, I just don't want to keep paying the emotional toll for a family that doesn't notice when I'm bleeding as long as the floor stays clean. This will be the last Thanksgiving I attend. I'm not leaving in a rage. I'm leaving because I'm finally full of words I've swallowed, full of silences I've padded with effort, full of a kind of grief that no one ever names because it's not loud enough to be taken seriously. I signed it with just my name, no love, no take care, no punctuation flourish, just a quiet, firm Emily. I folded the page once, placed it beneath the magnet, and pressed it flat against the fridge door as if anchoring it in place might stop anyone from trying to ignore it. The hum of the fridge continued, indifferent, while the voices from the living room rose and fell like a laugh track on a show that had long since stopped being funny. I didn't say goodbye when I left. I didn't pause in the doorway or look over my shoulder like someone exiting a scene. I walked to my car, started the engine, and drove without music, the sounds of the road washing over me like something between relief and sadness. Somewhere around exit 15, I pulled into a gas station, bought a bottle of water and a slice of microwave-warmed pumpkin pie, and ate it in my car under the flickering yellow lights of a half-broken sign. It was the best thing I'd tasted all day. I got home just past 11, tossed my shoes near the door, and fell into bed fully clothed, too tired to undress, too wired to sleep. The house was quiet. My apartment, cluttered and imperfect and wholly mine, held me in the way that place never had. At 6:22 the next morning, my phone buzzed. A single text from Julie, "What did you do?" She didn't sleep all night. I stared at it for a long time, not replying, not needing to. I imagined Mom pacing her kitchen, rereading every line of my letter, maybe for the first time realizing that I had been watching this whole time, that I had noticed, endured, remembered. Not with the petty spite of a child desperate for attention, but with the weary precision of someone who finally understands that staying silent doesn't make you noble, it makes you complicit. She hadn't called. She hadn't texted. But she hadn't slept. Sometimes the truth doesn't scream. Sometimes it just sits quietly in a kitchen you no longer belong to, written in ink that won't smudge. There's a particular kind of stillness that settles after a truth is spoken, not the dramatic, cinematic silence where glasses drop and hearts race, but something far subtler and stranger. Something that presses against the walls of a house like humidity after a summer storm, clinging to the corners of every room and making it impossible to breathe normally, as though the air itself is waiting for someone to flinch first. When I read Julie's message that morning, what did you do? She didn't sleep all night. I didn't respond, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew that, for once, I had said exactly enough. There was no spin to manage, no damage control to initiate, no explanation that would fix it, and more importantly, I no longer felt compelled to try. Still, the weight of the note lingered, not in a way that made me regret it, but in a way that reminded me just how much I'd been holding back for years. And since no one else seemed brave enough to say it aloud, since no one in my family could bring themselves to acknowledge the full scope of what they had allowed to fester beneath all the smiles and casserole dishes and picture-perfect thankfulness, I'll tell you what the note said. Word for word, line by line, because it wasn't cruel, and it wasn't a breakdown, and it wasn't a tantrum. It was a reckoning, calm and deliberate, every sentence a quiet match laid beside kindling they had piled for decades. I began with a sentence that had been growing inside me since I was 15 years old, sitting in the backseat of Julie's graduation party while Mom bragged about her scholarship and forgot to mention that I had just been named valedictorian at my own school. You always said we were a family built on values, I wrote, but I learned early on that the value you speak of is measurable: degrees, mortgages, marriages, and if someone's accomplishments couldn't be weighed, labeled, or shown off in your holiday letter, they became invisible. I kept my handwriting slow and steady, every letter deliberate, as if pacing my emotions into shape would somehow help them land clearer. You called me independent when I stopped coming home for spring break, but what you meant was I made things easier for you. You said you admired my strength when I paid my own rent, but you never offered to help, even when you knew I had nothing. You praised my resilience like it was a compliment, when really it was just your excuse for never showing up. I didn't write about my childhood in dramatic detail, not because I lacked examples, but because I didn't need to list them. She would know. She would remember. The times she forgot to pick me up from the debate tournament, the years I got birthday cards with $20 bills but no phone call, the time I told her I got published in a magazine and she said, "Well, let me know when it's the New Yorker." These weren't singular moments. They were a pattern, 1,000 tiny paper cuts that I'd been pretending didn't sting anymore. You said I was sensitive, I wrote next, and for a long time, I believed that was my problem. But now I see that sensitivity was never the issue. It was your discomfort with anything that required effort, reflection, or empathy beyond what you could handle in the 2 minutes between your errands. As I reread the note, one part stood out not for its harshness, but for its clarity. You said at dinner that you were thankful for the real achievers, and you stared straight at me while saying it. I don't know if you were trying to hurt me or just couldn't help yourself, but either way, you did. And maybe for the first time, I let myself admit that it hurt, not because I want your approval, but because, even after all this time, I still hoped you'd see me. Not the version you tolerated holidays, but the full, complicated, imperfect woman I fought to become without any of your guidance or interest. I closed the note with the line that, even as I wrote it, felt like both a boundary and a release. This is not a plea. This is not a punishment. This is a goodbye, not from life, but from the role you've cast me in and refused to rewrite. I'm stepping off the stage. From now on, I don't perform. I live. No dramatic sign-off. No love always. Just my name. After I placed it on the fridge and walked out that night, I didn't expect an explosion. In fact, I expected what usually followed moments like this. Avoidance, minimization, maybe a vague phone call where Mom would ask if I was doing okay in that tone that made it sound like she'd heard I was hospitalized. But this time was different. She didn't sleep. And while that might sound like a small thing to most people, to anyone who has ever lived with someone emotionally armored like my mother, you'll understand exactly how significant it was. Carol doesn't lose sleep over anything. Not over Julie's miscarriage, not over Matt's divorce, not even when our father left for a 3-week business trip that ended in a motel and a second family. She's the type who prided herself on being composed, who thought tears were unproductive and that apologies were concessions to weakness. So if she didn't sleep, it meant something cracked. Something got through. Maybe it wasn't regret. Maybe it wasn't recognition. But it was something. And for someone like her, even a sleepless night is a confession. Julie tried calling later that day. I let it go to voicemail. When I finally listened, her voice was unusually quiet, like she wasn't sure which side she was supposed to stand on. "I read the note," she said, "or Mom read it to me. I didn't realize how bad it felt for you. I guess I thought you liked being independent." There was a long pause before she added, "Do you really mean it about not coming back?" I didn't return her call. Not yet. Because I didn't owe her a retraction just because she was finally willing to listen. For the first time in years, I had said what needed saying, not in anger, but in truth, and the reverberations were not mine to soften. If they wanted to make sense of it, they could. If they wanted to talk, they'd have to do so without expecting me to walk it back just because it made them uncomfortable. And that's the part no one tells you about telling the truth. It doesn't always end in healing. It doesn't wrap in closure. Sometimes it just sits there like a clean wound, aching because it's no longer being ignored. And maybe that's the most honest form of peace there is. There's something strangely quiet that follows the unraveling of a well-rehearsed lie, not the kind of lie that involves blatant deception or dramatic confrontations, but the kind that lives in the small spaces between what's said and what's felt, a lie built on omissions, habits, and years of silently agreeing not to speak certain truths out loud. After I left that note behind, after the slow, deliberate unmasking of my resentment wrapped in careful phrasing and earned calm, I thought I'd feel triumphant or perhaps vindicated, as if all those years of biting my tongue and shrinking my presence would suddenly give way to a sense of righteous satisfaction. But instead, what settled in was something quieter, something heavier, and somehow more dignified, a deep, aching stillness that felt neither like a wound nor a victory, but something closer to relief, the kind that comes only when you stop pretending you're not starving and finally admit that you need something different to survive. Days passed, and I didn't hear from my mother. Not a call, not a text, not even one of her signature passive-aggressive forwarded emails with subject lines like, "Thought of you," followed by some outdated chain message about gratitude or endurance. Julie sent a few more messages, each one gentler than the last, as though she was carefully testing the water. Unsure if she was trying to defend our mother or to defend herself for never noticing just how far I'd been pushed to the perimeter of our family story. "She's not mad," Julie wrote in one message, "just hurt. I think you shook something in her. I think maybe you said what none of us could say." But I didn't respond, not because I wanted to punish anyone, but because I had no interest in managing anyone else's discomfort with a truth that had been mine alone to carry for decades. Then, 4 days after Thanksgiving, an envelope arrived in my mailbox, addressed in my mother's handwriting, which was unmistakable, neat, slanted slightly to the right, the kind of cursive that belonged to another era. Elegant in a way that made her look put together even when everything else was falling apart. Inside the envelope was a single photograph, an old one, clearly faded around the edges, of me at around age 6, sitting on the back porch in a dress I vaguely remembered disliking, my legs swinging, a chocolate ice cream cone melting down my wrist, and my mother behind me, holding the camera, her shadow cast long and tall over the patio stones. There was no note, no explanation, just the photo, as though she wanted me to remember something she couldn't find the words to say. Or perhaps she was reminding herself. I stared at that photo for a long time, not because it triggered some tidal wave of nostalgia or longing, but because it represented something real, a moment in time where we must have both been present, truly present, not just performing roles. And yet, the fact that this image, from nearly 30 years ago, was the one she chose to send spoke louder than any letter. It was a gesture, yes, but it was also a message. I remember you. Or maybe I don't know how to talk to the version of you that exists now, so I'm sending proof that you once existed in a way I understood. I didn't cry when I saw it. In fact, I felt something more complex than sadness, something harder to name. It was the realization that my mother and I may never reach a place of full understanding, that the space between us, built on years of expectations unmet and emotions misread, might never close entirely, and perhaps that was okay. Not everything broken needs to be repaired. Some things are simply meant to be seen clearly and accepted for what they are. The following week, I sat in my therapist's office, a small space that always smelled faintly of lavender and old books, and I told her everything, not just about the note, but about the years that led up to it, the birthday calls that never came. The way my mother always seemed surprised when I shared anything about my life, as though she had to remind herself that I was more than just a vague outline in family photographs. My therapist, a soft-spoken woman with eyes that saw far more than I ever said, didn't offer a solution because she knew I wasn't looking for one. Instead, she asked me a question that stayed with me long after our session ended. Now that you've said it, now that the silence is broken, what are you going to do with the space that's been cleared? It was a question I couldn't answer immediately, because for the first time, I was standing in a life that no longer revolved around proving anything to people who had already made up their minds about who I was. The space that truth had carved out was unfamiliar, but it was mine, and it was wide open. Later that evening, I sat at my desk with a cup of tea and opened a blank document. I titled the page, "The Thank You That Broke the Silence." I didn't know whether it would become an essay, a chapter, or just another private piece of writing I'd file away in my folder titled Unsent, but I knew I had something to say, something shaped not by pain, but by clarity. I began to write, slowly at first, then with growing confidence, not about revenge, not about blame, but about the moment someone stops waiting for recognition and starts choosing their own reflection. I wrote about love that comes with terms and conditions, about families that forget how to see each other, about the quiet power of saying enough, not in anger, but in finality. And as the words formed, I realized that this wasn't the end of something, it was the beginning of living without the need for approval, without the exhausting hunger for acknowledgement from people who never learned how to hold space for anyone else's complexity. I didn't need my mother to say she was wrong. I didn't need Julie to apologize. I didn't even need the photo she sent. I only needed to know that I had said it, out loud, on paper, and that someone had read it, and maybe, for the first time, they couldn't unhear it. Because sometimes the most radical act of love you can offer yourself is to stop returning to places where you are only ever welcomed for what you represent and never for who you truly are. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that not every ending is an explosion. Some are just doors closing gently behind you, not because you slammed them, but because you finally understood that you were never obligated to keep them open. Now, when I think of Thanksgiving, I don't think of turkey or toasts or the aching silence of being overlooked. I think of that note. I think of what it cost to write it. And I think of what it gave me in return. Not reconciliation, not repair, but release. And sometimes, release is more sacred than forgiveness.